Settle in now, and let your shoulders soften. Let the day you carried this far slip quietly from your hands. Tonight we are going far out into the open ocean, to a long, slow afternoon in the winter of 1872, where the sea is wide and gray and gentle, and a small wooden ship is about to find something it cannot quite explain. Imagine, first, the sky. A pale, washed sort of sky, the color of old linen folded in a drawer. It is the 5th of December, and the sun is low, the kind of low winter sun that lays its light across the water in a single, long, soft stripe, like a path you could almost step out and walk on. The Atlantic Ocean stretches in every direction, hundreds of miles of slow swell, breathing the way a sleeping animal breathes, rising, falling, with no shore in sight and no other ship to break the line of the horizon. On this great, breathing emptiness, picture a single, small vessel under sail. She is called the Gratia, a Canadian brigantine bound from New York to Gibraltar, carrying a cargo of petroleum in tidy wooden barrels deep in her hold. She is a sturdy, modest ship, scarred a little by weather, her sails patched neatly with the careful hand of men who know how to make things last. Her decks have been scrubbed that morning, and the smell of damp wood and rope and salt hangs softly in the air. Captain David Morehouse stands at the rail with his coat buttoned to the throat. He is a quiet, watchful man, the sort of captain who notices small things. The angle of a halyard, the color of a cloud. The wind today is light, and the sea is unusually calm for December. A slow, glassy sort of calm, where the waves have rounded their shoulders and seem reluctant to break. The only sounds are the creak of timber, the slap of water against the hull, the cry of a far-off seabird. And then, at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, somewhere out in that long, pale stripe of sun, the lookout above sees a sail. Just a sail. A small white shape on the horizon, very far away, the size of a feather laid against the sky. There is nothing strange about a sail at sea. Ships pass each other on these lanes all the time, exchanging a flag, a wave, a few words across the water, and at first the men of the Gratia think very little of it. They watch idly, the way you might watch a bird settle on a fence in the distance. The captain stays at his rail. The afternoon goes on, but the sail does not behave the way a sail should. Slowly, as the minutes pass, Captain Morehouse begins to feel that small, prickling stir at the back of the neck that sailors learn to trust. The other ship is moving, but moving oddly. Not steady, not purposeful, but swaying, wandering, the way a person wanders when they are lost in thought and have forgotten where their feet are taking them. She is heading roughly north, though the wind would suggest another course. Her sails are not properly set. Some are full and drawing, others hang slack, and one or two seem to be missing altogether, as though the ship had begun a careful piece of work and then, halfway through, simply stopped. He raises his spyglass. The brass is cold against his cheek. He turns the little wheel, and the distant ship drifts into focus, blurry at first, then sharper still, until he can see her shape clearly against the silver water. A brigantine, 2 masts, about 100 feet long, painted dark along her sides. He can see the patchwork of her canvas. He can see the thin gleam of her wet decks. He can see, too, that there is no one on her wheel. For a long moment, the captain does not lower the glass. The wind moves a strand of his hair. The sea breathes its slow, heavy breath. And out there, perhaps 6 miles off, the strange ship sails on, alone, riding the long swells with no hand at her helm and no flag of distress, no smoke, no answering wave from any deck. Only the small white triangles of her sails turning gently, patiently, against the falling afternoon light. Captain Morehouse lowers the glass. He looks once at his first mate, Oliver DeVoe, who has come quietly to stand beside him. Neither man speaks for a moment. They are both old enough, and have been at sea long enough, to know that something is wrong. They simply do not yet know what. And so, on this calm December afternoon, in the middle of an ocean that has gone very still, the Gratia turns her bow gently toward the stranger, and begins, ever so slowly, to close the distance between them. But before we follow the Gratia across that last quiet stretch of water, before we step aboard the strange, silent ship she is approaching, it is worth slipping backward a little in time. Backward, away from the open Atlantic. Backward, past the empty deck and the half-eaten meal and the missing lifeboat. Backward to a small New England town, where a man we have not yet met is preparing, with quiet pride, for one more honest voyage. His name is Benjamin Spooner Briggs, and to understand the mystery of the Mary Celeste, you have first to understand the kind of man who was standing at her wheel. He was born in Wareham, Massachusetts, and grew up just down the coast in the village of Marion, a soft, salt-scented place of white clapboard houses and low stone walls, where the church bell could be heard from almost every kitchen, and the harbor was never more than a short walk away. The Briggs family had been seafarers for generations. His father was a captain. His brothers were captains. The smell of tarred rope and damp canvas was, for Benjamin, simply the smell of home. By the time he took command of the Mary Celeste in the autumn of 1872, he was 37 years old. A serious, gentle, capable man. Tall, with a careful beard, and the steady eyes of someone who had spent half his life watching weather come in across open water. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He read his Bible by lantern light in the little cabin at the stern. He wrote to his mother regularly. He believed, in that earnest 19th century way, that a ship was not just a piece of property, but a kind of small floating parish, a place where a captain was responsible for souls and not only for cargo. He had been to sea by then more times than he could easily count. He had carried lumber and petroleum and coal and grain. He had rounded capes and weathered gales and slipped quietly through doldrums where the sails hung as still as washing on a line. He was, by every account that has come down to us, an excellent sailor, cautious, methodical, the sort of master that owners trusted and that crews were glad to sail under. But the thing that mattered most about Benjamin Briggs, the thing that makes the Mary Celeste so haunting in the end, was not really his seamanship. It was his family. He had married Sarah Elizabeth Cobb, the daughter of a Marian minister, some 10 years earlier. By all the small, surviving evidence, the letters, the photographs, the recollections of neighbors, they were deeply, quietly in love. Sarah was a thoughtful woman, fond of music. She played a small parlor melodeon, a kind of pump organ which she loved enough to bring with her to sea. She had sailed with her husband before. She knew the rhythm of life aboard. She knew how to fold herself into the tight little world of a brigantine and make it feel, somehow, like a parlor in Massachusetts. And then there was Sophia. Sophia Matilda Briggs. 2 years old that autumn. A bright, fair-haired little child with her mother's gentle face and her father's serious eyes. She had only just learned, in the months before the voyage, to walk steadily on her own small feet and to say a handful of careful words. Her parents had decided that she was old enough now, and the Atlantic crossing gentle enough at that time of year, that she could come along. Their 7-year-old son, Arthur, would stay behind in Marion with his grandmother and continue with school. But Sophia would sail. The little family would be together. So when the Mary Celeste left New York Harbor in early November of 1872, bound for Genoa with a cargo of denatured alcohol in her hold, she was not, in any meaningful sense, only a merchant ship. She was a working vessel, yes. She was a hard-working American brigantine, two-masted, square-rigged on the foremast, plain and unromantic in her lines. But she was also, in those weeks, a floating home. There were nursery toys in the captain's cabin. There was a small organ, tucked carefully against a bulkhead. There was a tiny pair of shoes near the bunk. There were, somewhere in Sarah's careful luggage, the soft blankets in which a sleeping toddler is wrapped on cool evenings at sea. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of ship from which no one at all, would ever willingly walk away. And yet, before we follow that family any further into the silence that is waiting for them, let us pause for a long, slow moment and consider the ship itself, for she is, in her quiet way, the second great character of this story, and she deserves to be properly met. Her name, on that November morning, was the Mary Celeste, though she had not always carried it. She had been launched a dozen years earlier in a small Nova Scotian shipyard on Spencer's Island, where the smell of fresh-cut spruce drifted out across the Bay of Fundy, and the men who built her tapped her seams with the unhurried patience of people who lived by tides. In those days she had been called the Amazon, a smaller, plainer thing, and she had earned, almost from the moment her keel touched water, a reputation among sailors as a vessel of small misfortunes. A captain who died on her maiden voyage, a fire in her hold, a collision in the English Channel, none of them disastrous, none of them quite forgivable either, the kind of accumulated bad luck that follows a ship the way fog follows a low coast. So she was sold and rebuilt and lengthened and given new sails and a new copper-fastened hull, and at last a new name, because sailors are quietly superstitious people, and a new name on the bow is a soft prayer that the past will let go. She emerged from her second life as a brigantine of 282 tons, 103 feet from stem to stern, 25 feet across her rounded beam, and a deep, generous hold that could swallow whole cargoes of barreled goods. She carried 2 masts, a square-rigged foremast that caught the trade winds in great handfuls of canvas, and a fore and aft rigged mainmast that let her steer close to the breeze when the open sea turned contrary. Her bow lifted in a long, graceful sheer, her stern was square and modest, and along her sides ran a low rail, scrubbed pale by years of salt water, and by the patient knees of sailors at their evening prayers. Below decks, she was a quiet, well-kept little world of polished pine and oiled brass. The captain's cabin, aft, had a small writing table, a bunk built into the bulkhead, a sea chest, a chronometer ticking softly in its gimbaled box, and a window of thick glass that looked out over the wake. Forward of that lay the mate's cabin and a small saloon, and a galley scarcely larger than a pantry, where a coal stove warmed kettles of coffee and pots of beef and barley through the long Atlantic evenings. Beyond the galley, the Fox lay, the forward crew quarters, held narrow bunks for 7 sailors, each with his own small shelf, his own oilskin, his own tin cup hanging from a peg that swung gently with the swell. And between these two ends of her, between the family aft and the men forward, lay her great purpose, the hold. In the hold, that November, were stowed 1,701 red oak barrels of denatured alcohol, industrial spirit, bound from a New York refinery to the city of Genoa, where it would be used for fortifying wines and cleaning machinery and 100 other small Italian errands. The barrels had been loaded slowly and carefully through a narrow hatch on Pier 50 of the East River, each one rolled into place by men in heavy gloves and lashed down with stout rope until the whole cargo lay packed beneath the deck like the cells of an enormous wooden honeycomb. The total weight was something near 1,700 tons of liquid. The total value, some 36,000 American dollars of the day, a sum that could have built a modest church. It was an ordinary cargo for an ordinary voyage, and the Mary Celeste, with her copper sheathing and her rebuilt hull and her quiet new name, was by every reasonable measure an ordinary ship, perhaps a little unlucky, but no more so than 100 others crossing the same sea routes that month. She was sound. She was insured. She was rigged for hard weather and trimmed for an Atlantic crossing in late autumn. The ship's papers were in order, the chronometer was wound, the sextant was in its velvet-lined box, the medicine chest was full, and somewhere, in a cool, dark corner of the captain's cabin, a small harmonium waited beneath its quilted cover for the next quiet evening, when Sarah might lift the lid and play. Everything aboard her that November morning was exactly where it ought to be. Everything, that is, except what was about to be missing. The morning of November the 7th, 1872, opened over New York Harbor with the kind of gray, rain-washed light that belongs entirely to late autumn at sea. The water along the East River was the color of pewter, and a stiff easterly wind came pushing in over the rooftops of Manhattan, ruffling the harbor into small, restless ridges. Gulls wheeled in slow, patient arcs above the masts. Somewhere down on Pier 50, a steam tug was already chuffing its quiet morning breath into the cold air, getting ready to nudge the Mary Celeste out into the channel. Captain Briggs had been awake since well before dawn. He stood now in his long, dark coat near the helm, his beard trimmed close, his collar turned up against the damp, watching the last of the cargo hatches being battened down and sealed with strips of canvas and tar. He spoke softly to his men as he moved among them, asking after a knot here, a lashing there, never raising his voice. The crew already knew his manner. He was a master who preferred the quiet word to the shouted order, and the ship answered him in the same tone. Below, in the stern cabin, Sarah Briggs was settling little Sophia into the narrow built-in bunk that had been made up just for her, with 2 thick wool blankets and a small pillow stuffed with goose down. The cabin smelled of new paint and beeswax and the faint sweetness of pine from the paneling. A brass oil lamp swung gently on its gimbal above the table, throwing a soft amber circle onto the polished wood. Outside the small square stern window, the harbor slid past in soft, foggy panels of gray, and Sophia, only 2 years old, watched it with wide and sleepy eyes, one small hand wrapped around her mother's finger. Sarah hummed something under her breath as she tucked the blankets in. Perhaps a hymn from home, perhaps nothing at all, just the soft, tuneless humming a mother makes when she is content and her child is warm. She had crossed oceans before. She knew the rhythm of a ship leaving a great port. She knew that the first hour was always the busiest, and that after that, the sea would settle the household into its own slow domestic time. Up on deck, the order came at last to cast off. The line slipped from the bollards with a soft, wet thump. The tug took up the strain, and the Mary Celeste, 280 tons of seasoned oak and pine, began to move. She passed the long stone arms of the harbor, the warehouses of Brooklyn drifting by on one side, the spires of lower Manhattan softening into the mist on the other. And then, beyond Sandy Hook, the tug let her go with 3 short blasts of its whistle, and the Mary Celeste was alone with the wind. The squall arrived almost at once. Not a great storm, only the brisk, businesslike weather of an Atlantic November, but enough to make the rigging sing and the sails crack like sheets of canvas being shaken out on a clothesline. The bow lifted and fell in the long, easy way of a brigantine that has been at sea most of her life. Spray flew up over the rail in pale handfuls and pattered down across the deck like the lightest rain. In the stern cabin, the lamp swung a little wider on its gimbal, and Sophia, instead of crying, laughed. A small, surprised, delighted laugh at the funny new feeling of the floor tipping under her bare feet. Sarah laughed too, and caught her up, and the two of them sat together on the bunk, listening to the deep, steady creak of the ship's bones learning their winter posture. At his small writing desk, Captain Briggs opened the logbook. He uncapped the inkwell, dipped his pen, and made the first careful entry of the voyage in his neat, sloping hand. The date, the wind, the barometer, the course set east by southeast for the Azores. He blew gently across the wet ink, watched it darken into the page, and then closed the book with a small, satisfied tap. He stepped out once more onto the deck. The lights of New York were already dissolving into the gray behind them, no brighter now than a handful of yellow seeds scattered along a far horizon. Ahead, there was only the open Atlantic, wide and unwritten, the color of slate, and the long, slow road toward the Azores that lay somewhere out there beneath the soft gray weather, waiting quietly for the Mary Celeste to come. And so, almost without anyone noticing, the long road began. The first days slipped by the way days at sea so often do, quietly and a little dreamily, with 1 hour folding gently into the next. The slate-gray water turned to dark green, and then, by the third morning, to a soft and patient blue, and the Mary Celeste settled into her stride. She was, after all, a working ship, not a grand one, a small American merchant brigantine carrying barrels of pure alcohol bound for Italy, and she went about her business with the steady, unhurried manner of an old draft horse who has walked this road many times before. Life on board fell into its old, familiar shape almost at once. There was the ship's bell, of course, marking the watches in soft, polite chimes. 1 bell, 2 bells, 3, counting out the hours from dawn to dusk and on into the night, until the men on watch could nearly tell the time by the way the sound carried on the wind. There were the watches themselves, 4 hours on and 4 hours off, a slow, turning wheel of duty and rest that pressed sleep and waking gently together until they felt like the same thing. There were the meals in the small galley, salt pork, hard biscuit, beans cooked slowly in an iron pot, coffee strong enough to wake a stone, and the smell of it all drifting up from below in the cold morning air, mingling with the salt and the tar and the clean bite of the sea. And there was, in the very middle of it all, a family. In the small captain's cabin at the stern, Sarah Briggs had made a kind of home. She had brought soft blankets and a few books and her little melodeon, a small reed organ with bellows worked by the knees, no bigger than a sewing box, and in the long, quiet afternoons she would sit on the edge of the bunk and play. Hymns, mostly, the kind sung in small New England chapels on Sunday mornings, simple tunes that any sailor would have known from his boyhood. The notes would drift up the companionway and out into the rigging, and the men working on deck would slow their hands for a moment and listen, smiling to themselves, and then go on coiling rope and mending sail as if nothing at all had happened. And little Sophia, 2 years old and round-cheeked and brave, was learning to walk on a deck that would not stay still. She would totter from her mother's hand to the leg of a chair, and from the chair to her father's knee, frowning seriously at the way the floor kept tilting under her tiny shoes. The sailors, who were rough men with rough hands, grew very gentle around her. They saved the smoothest pieces of wood from the carpenter's bench and carved them into small toys, a horse, a little boat, a wooden whistle, and left them shyly outside the cabin door without saying who had brought them. Above, the great sails breathed in and out with the wind. The wake unrolled behind the ship like a long, pale ribbon, white at the edges, fading slowly into the blue. Sometimes a flock of small gray and white birds would appear out of nowhere and follow them for half a day, dipping and rising on the air, and then vanish again toward some quieter part of the sea. Once a school of dolphins ran beside the bow for an hour, leaping in clean silver arcs, and Sophia stood on her father's shoulder and clapped her small hands and laughed. At night, when the day's work was done and the great wide darkness came down over the Atlantic, the lamps would be lit in the cabin, small yellow flames behind glass, warm as honey, and Sarah would sit with her sewing, and the captain with his charts, and Sophia would already be asleep in her little bunk, one hand curled under her cheek. The wind would speak in long, soft sentences in the rigging overhead. The hull would creak gently, the way an old wooden house creaks at night when it is settling down. And somewhere far above, beyond the masts and the canvas, the stars would wheel slowly westward over an empty sea. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was strange. The days were quiet and the nights were quiet, and the ship moved steadily on toward the Azores beneath a soft and uneventful sky. 10 people, one small wooden world, drifting eastward across the long, sleeping back of the November Atlantic. And then, somewhere out on that long blue road, the ship reached the Azores. You can picture them, those islands rising slowly out of the Atlantic like the green backs of sleeping animals. Small, gentle shapes of volcanic stone wrapped in mist and pasture. Cattle drowsing in high meadows. White villages tucked against the hills. Vineyards and low stone walls, and laundry drying in the soft sea wind. The Azores have always been a quiet waypoint for ships crossing from America to Europe, a familiar set of green smudges on the horizon, a place where weary sailors look up from their work and remember that the world is not, after all, only water. The Mary Celeste passed near these islands in the 3rd week of November. We know this because of the log. For a captain at sea, the logbook is a small daily ritual. A few neat lines written each morning, recording the wind, the weather, the ship's position, the course steered through the night. It is one of the steady, calming heartbeats of a long voyage. And on board the Mary Celeste, that heartbeat continued faithfully, hour after hour, day after day, in Captain Briggs' careful hand. The very last entry was made on the morning of November the 25th, 1872. It was written, not in the leather-bound logbook itself, but on a small navigation slate. The chalkboard kept near the wheel, where positions were jotted down quickly before being copied later into the proper ledger. At 8 o'clock in the morning, somebody on the Mary Celeste, almost certainly the captain, marked the ship's place on that slate. They were just to the north of the island of Santa Maria, the southernmost of the Azores. 6 miles off, more or less. The volcanic shoulders of the island would have been visible to port, low and green against the dawn, perhaps still wearing a soft cap of cloud from the night before. Imagine that morning for a moment. The early light coming up over the eastern Atlantic, pale gold and silver. The deck of the Mary Celeste damp with dew. The little daughter, Sophia, perhaps still asleep below in her small bunk, her cheek against the wood. Her mother, Sarah, perhaps in the galley, putting on the kettle, warming bread for breakfast. The cook moving quietly between his pots. The sailors on watch, drowsy and content, holding the wheel, watching the green island slide slowly past on the southern horizon. It was, by every sign we have, an ordinary morning. The position on the slate is steady. The handwriting is calm. There is no note of alarm, no scribbled urgency, no last word for anyone left behind. Just the date, the time, the place, and the patient routine of a working ship, doing what working ships do. And then silence. Because somewhere, in the hours or the days that followed, something happened on the Mary Celeste that we have never, in all the long years since, been able to explain. Somewhere between that quiet morning off Santa Maria and the moment, 2 weeks later, when she would be found sailing alone toward the Strait of Gibraltar, every living soul on board would step off the deck and disappear. 10 people. The captain, his wife, their small daughter, 7 sailors. A whole little floating household with its breakfasts and its songs and its laundry and its lullabies, gone as though carried gently away on the wind. We do not know which day it was. We do not know what hour. We do not know if it happened in bright sunshine or under a soft gray rain. We do not know if it was sudden in a single startled minute or slow over a long, uncertain afternoon. The sea kept its own counsel. The ship sailed on. And the only witness, the long Atlantic itself, has never said a word. So somewhere out there, in the calm space between those green volcanic islands and the rocky gates of Gibraltar, In a stretch of ocean, perhaps 400 or 500 miles wide and 1,000 miles long, 10 lives quietly closed. 10 pairs of footsteps left the wooden deck of the Mary Celeste for the last time. The kettle was left in the galley. The breakfast was left on the table. The slate was left near the wheel, with its small chalk numbers from the morning of the 25th. And the ship, empty now but still alive in every line and sail, turned her bow patiently toward Europe and went on without them, eastward, eastward, beneath the soft gray winter sky, carrying her quiet cargo and her quieter mystery into the long, slow days that followed. For 10 quiet days she sailed that way, alone with her own creaking and a soft clap of canvas, until on the afternoon of December the 5th, in the long blue distance west of the Azores, another vessel saw her and turned to follow. That vessel was the Gratia, a Canadian brigantine herself, bound from New York to Gibraltar with a hold full of petroleum and a captain named Morehouse, who had, by chance, dined with Captain Briggs only a few weeks before they had each set out. Morehouse watched the strange ship for 2 full hours through his glass. Her sails were set oddly, the jib and foretopmast staysail drawing nicely on the starboard tack, but other sails furled or hanging loose, as if no one were minding her. She yawed gently, falling off the wind and coming back, falling off and coming back, like a sleeper turning in bed. No flag answered his signal. No face appeared at her rail. After a long, careful approach across the slow gray-blue swell, he sent over a small boat with 3 men, his mate Oliver DeVoe, the second mate, and a seaman. They rowed across in the late afternoon light and climbed her side, and stepped onto a deck that was utterly, completely quiet. The first thing DeVoe noticed was that the ship was sound. She was not sinking. She was not damaged in any way that he could see. Her hull was tight. Her masts stood straight. Her rigging, though some of it had carried away in the upper sails, a topsail blown out, some braces hanging loose, was, on the whole, in fair and seamanlike order. This was not a wreck. This was a ship that had simply been set down by her people and left to drift on, untended, like a kettle taken off the fire. He went below. In the cabin he found 6 months of provisions, barrels of salt beef, salt pork, flour, dried peas, hard bread, enough food and water to feed 10 people halfway around the world. The galley stove was cold but unbroken. The pots were where pots should be. In the captain's cabin, the bed was unmade in the small, ordinary way of a bed slept in the night before. There was a sewing machine on the small table with a bit of cloth still under the needle and a child's clothes folded nearby. Small woolen things, soft from washing, belonging to little Sophia. There was a melodeon, a small reed organ, against one wall. There was a bottle of cough medicine, uncorked, standing upright, not a drop spilled, though the ship had been rolling alone for 10 days. But certain things were gone. The ship's chronometer, the precious clock that told the navigator his longitude, was missing. The sextant was missing. The ship's register and the captain's papers were missing. The ship's logbook was still there on its shelf, with its last entry written in Briggs's neat hand on the morning of the 25th of November, recording position and weather, and nothing alarming at all. But the navigation book, the one a captain might grab on his way out, was gone. The compass binnacle on deck was damaged. its glass broken, its instrument taken or lost. And the small yawl, the ship's only lifeboat, lashed across the main hatch, was no longer there. The lashings had not been cut. The lashings had been untied, carefully, the way a sailor unties a thing he means to use. On deck, one of the small hatches, the forward scuttle, stood open to the sky. So did the lazarette hatch aft. The main hatch was on, secure, undisturbed. The cargo of 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol lay quiet beneath it. There was a little water in the hold, 3 or 4 feet, but no more than an old wooden ship might take through her seams in heavy weather, and the pumps, when DeVoe tried them, worked perfectly well. A peopled ship, in other words, with no people in her. A breakfast laid, a sewing needle still in cloth, 6 months of dinners waiting in the pantry, a cough syrup standing upright on a shelf, and the navigator's instruments, the navigator's papers, and the only small boat, all carried away by hands that had taken the time to do it tidily, and then had stepped down into the open water and left the larger, safer, sounder vessel behind them, sailing on alone beneath the gentle Atlantic sky. DeVoe stood for a long moment in the silent cabin, listening to the ship breathe around him, and could not, for the life of him, understand what he was seeing. And so, very gently, a decision was made on that quiet stretch of ocean. Captain Morehouse and his men, after long, slow conversation in the lee of their own steady deck, agreed that the Mary Celeste could not be left to drift on alone. The law of the sea allowed for salvage, for a ship found abandoned to be brought safely into port by those who rescued her, and the nearest friendly harbor, the one with a proper court that could untangle so strange a finding, lay nearly 600 miles to the east, beneath the great pale rock of Gibraltar. So DeVoe, with a small handful of men, stepped back aboard the silent Brigantine and took her wheel. The Gratia, smaller crew now, sailed close beside her, like a mother walking a sleeping child home. For more than a week, the two ships moved slowly together over a softening sea, lanterns swinging in answer to one another through the long blue evenings, while inside the Mary Celeste, the breakfast plates and the sewing needle and the quiet little melodeon waited, untouched, for owners who did not come. They reached Gibraltar on a mild morning in mid-December, the rock rising out of the haze like a sleeping lion, the harbor crowded with merchant ships and steam packets, and the masts of every nation in Christendom. Bells rang gently across the water. Bumboats bobbed between the moorings, selling oranges and tobacco, and the warm Mediterranean light came down softly over the white houses on the slope. Into this calm, busy port, the 2 American brigantines slipped, one full of weary, relieved sailors, and the other carrying nothing at all but its mystery. And here, beneath palm trees and pale stone, a different kind of voyage began. The British Vice Admiralty Court opened its doors, and into its quiet, wood-paneled rooms walked a man named Frederick Sollyflood, Her Majesty's advocate and proctor for the Queen, a gentleman of fierce mustaches, sharper opinions, and a deep, almost romantic love of suspicion. He was, by every account, a kindly soul in private life and a tireless seeker of villains in public, and from the moment he set foot upon the Mary Celeste's deck, he became convinced, with all the warmth of his certain heart, that something terrible had happened, and that someone, somewhere, was hiding it. Through the gentle Mediterranean winter, and into the long blossoming spring of 1873, the hearings unfolded at the slow, patient, pace of all Admiralty courts. Surveyors went aboard with measuring tapes and lanterns and crawled into every corner of the hold. They tasted the bilge water. They sniffed the air in the cabin. They peered at a small cut along the bow rail and called it a mark of violence, and later, more soberly, called it ordinary wear. They found a dark stain on the deck, and Mr. Solly Flood, with great feeling, declared it blood, and an analyst in London, weeks afterwards, with no feeling at all, declared it was not. Theories drifted through Gibraltar like the warm afternoon breezes. Some said the crew had mutinied, broken into the cargo of 9/10 pure alcohol, and murdered the captain and his family in a drunken rage. But the alcohol was industrial, undrinkable, and not a single barrel had been touched. Some whispered of insurance fraud, of a secret arrangement between Captain Briggs and Captain Morehouse, but the two men had only briefly known each other, and the Mary Celeste was insured for far too modest a sum to tempt any honest soul to ruin. Some spoke of pirates, though pirates do not leave 6 months of salt beef in the larder. Some spoke of madness, of poisoning by moldy bread, of strange Atlantic gases, and each theory in turn was carried in on the morning tide and carried gently out again on the evening one. In the end, after months of careful hearings, after pages and pages of testimony copied out in slow brown ink, the court could prove nothing. No crime was named. No villain was found. The Salvage award given to the de Gratia was small, smaller than such a recovery usually earned, as though the judges, unable to accuse, had simply withheld their full blessing in the lingering shadow of a doubt that would not lift. And the Mary Celeste, declared seaworthy once more, was handed quietly back to her owners, to sail again under new captains, into new waters, carrying with her, wherever she went, the soft and stubborn silence of one unanswered December afternoon. And so the years began to drift over her story, the way snow drifts across a quiet field, softening every edge, without ever quite covering the shape beneath. In the parlors of Boston and the coffee houses of London, in the wheelhouses of merchant ships and the back rooms of insurance offices, men leaned closer to their lamps and offered, one after another, the comfort of a possible answer. The first to glow and the longest to linger was the theory of the alcohol. 1,700 barrels of raw industrial spirit had ridden in her hold, and 9 of those barrels, when she was finally unloaded in Genoa, were found to be empty. Perhaps, the careful voices said, the warm autumn passage had stirred up vapors. Perhaps a sudden creak of the hatches had let a thin, invisible cloud rise into the November air. Perhaps Captain Briggs, smelling something sharp and unfamiliar, had ordered everyone into the yawl boat as a precaution, meaning only to drift behind on a tow line for an hour or two, while the ship aired herself out. And perhaps that tow line, in some sudden gust, had parted with a small dry snap that no one heard above the wind, and the Brigantine had simply sailed on without them, faster than any rowing arms could ever hope to follow. It was a tender theory, almost kind. It needed no villains, no monsters, no cruelty. Only a rope, and a breath of wind, and a moment of bad luck. Others, leaning over their charts, spoke of the waterspout. A pillar of spinning sea, they said, could rise out of a calm afternoon without warning, dropping the barometer, soaking the decks, sending the bilge water sloshing high into the pumps until the captain, reading his soundings, believed the ship to be foundering when she was, in truth, only briefly drenched. In that mistaken alarm, the theory went, the family and the crew might have hurried into the small boat, watching from a low wave as their tall ship, steadier than they knew, sailed serenely on into a horizon that would not give her back. There were quieter theories, too. A seaquake, some whispered, a deep tremor far below the keel, shaking the rigging and rattling the cabin doors, frightening a careful man into one careful decision too many. A faulty pump, said others, miscalibrated by the long voyage, showing more water in the hold than truly lay there. A sudden illness, a bad reading of the lead line, a chronometer that had drifted, leaving them uncertain how near the rocks of Santa Maria really were, until the fear of grounding became larger in that small wooden world than the fear of the open sea. For a while in the more excitable papers, there were pirates, long knives in the moonlight, a silent boarding off the Azores, a treasure that no one could quite name. But the cargo had been intact, and the captain's money still in its drawer, and the pirate theory, lovely as it was for a winter evening's reading, kept slipping through the fingers of anyone who tried to hold it firmly. There were no signs of struggle, no bloodied rail, no splintered door, no last desperate message scratched into a beam. Only the breakfast, half eaten, and the cold tea, and the small shoe. Some theories grew stranger as the decades passed. A giant squid, said one writer, rising out of the deep to pluck the souls one by one from the deck. A magnetic anomaly. A cloud of mysterious gas. A patch of cursed water. Each of these glowed for a season in the imagination of the world, then drifted, like a lantern set adrift on a slow river, back into the soft dark from which it had come. And the gentlest theory of all, the one that has aged best, is simply this: that a careful captain, with his wife and his small daughter and his 7 trusted men, made a careful decision in a moment of imperfect information, climbed into a small boat to wait out a danger that turned out not to be a danger, and was carried away in the great patient fairness of the sea before he could climb back aboard. No drama, no villain, only the slow arithmetic of distance and wind and a rope that did not hold. Each theory has had its hour by the fire. Each has warmed its hands a while at the puzzle, and then, with a small, respectful nod, stepped back into the long hall of the unknown, leaving the door just slightly open behind it, the way thoughtful guests do when the hour grows late and the house begins, gently, to sleep. So let us, in our turn, sit a little while longer by that fire, and gather up what we do know, and hold it gently, the way one holds a smooth stone found on a long walk by the sea. We know that on the 7th of November 1872, a small wooden ship slipped out of New York Harbor with 10 souls aboard. We know her name was the Mary Celeste, and that she carried a cargo of pure alcohol bound for the warm hills above Genoa. We know her captain was a quiet, careful man named Benjamin Briggs, who liked his Bible and his sextant and the smell of fresh coffee in the morning watch. We know his wife Sarah came with him, her sewing basket tucked beside the cabin organ, her letters home folded with the patience of someone who loved her husband enough to follow him across an ocean. And we know that little Sophia, 2 years old, with her small shoes and her small wooden toys, came with them too, learning to walk on a deck that gently rose and fell, learning the wide world from the safe circle of her mother's arms. We know that somewhere between the Azores and the Strait of Gibraltar, on a stretch of ocean wide enough to hide almost anything, all 10 of them stepped, or were carried, or were drawn into the lifeboat. And we know that the lifeboat, with whatever it held, slipped its line and was lost. That is what we know. The rest is sea and silence and the soft sound of waves we will never hear. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps not every story is meant to end with all its questions answered. Perhaps some are meant simply to be remembered, the way a candle is remembered after it is burned down. Not for its final flicker, but for the warm light it gave while it lasted. So let us remember them as they were on a good morning, before any of this. Benjamin at the chart table, pencil in hand, plotting a course in his neat schoolmaster script. Sarah in the small cabin, brushing Sophia's fine hair, humming an old hymn she had learned as a girl in Massachusetts. Sophia, watching the brass lamp swing slowly above her, reaching up with one small finger to trace the path of the light. The kettle warm, the breakfast set, the sea beyond the porthole, a calm and friendly blue. That is the picture the Mary Celeste has carried for us, all these long years, across all these long miles. Not the mystery, the morning, and the ship herself, that stubborn, faithful little Brigantine. She has long since gone to her own rest, run aground at last in 1885 on a coral reef off Haiti, lying down in warm blue water as if she had simply grown tired of the long question. But the wake she made in our imagination has never quite closed. Sailors still speak her name in low voices on long night watches. Writers still pull up a chair and turn her pages. Children, hearing the story for the first time by some other fire on some other evening, still feel that small, sweet shiver of wonder that the world is wider and stranger than the map suggests. Outside our own window now, the night has settled in fully. The fire has burned down to a soft red breathing, the kind that asks nothing of you. Somewhere very far away, the Atlantic is doing what it has always done, turning over and over in its great slow sleep, keeping its old secrets the way a grandmother keeps the names of flowers, quietly, kindly, without need to share them. In the small cabin of the Mary Celeste, in the picture we have built together, the lamps are guttering low. The chart on the table has gone soft at its edges. Sarah's sewing basket sits closed beside the organ. Sophia's little shoes are placed neatly side by side. Benjamin's logbook lies open at a page that no one will ever finish. And the ship, in our remembering, sails on. Not toward Gibraltar, not toward Genoa. Just on into the soft dark, the way ships do in dreams, with a fair wind and an easy sea, and no need ever again of harbor. Sleep gently, listener, wherever you are. The fire will keep until morning. The story will keep until you wish to hear it again. And the Mary Celeste, that small, brave ship, will keep on sailing through the quiet country between waking and sleep, her sails full of starlight, her crew somehow whole again, bound for a port that has no name and asks no questions. Good night, Benjamin. Good night, Sarah. Good night, little Sophia. Good night.